Hey there, welcome to Backcountry Pilgrim, a channel all about hiking, camping, backpacking, and the gear that goes with it. Today I want to talk to you about tarp camping. What exactly is tarp camping? Is it just for elitist hikers, or is it something that you might want to try out yourself? Here I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you might want to try tarp camping, but I'm also going to be realistic and give you a few reasons why you might not. First of all, what exactly is tarp camping? Well, it's not just a clever title, folks. It's just camping with a tarp. Specifically, it's using a tarp for your shelter. Now, here I am not just talking about getting your big Walmart tarp, trudging out into the wilderness and tying it to some trees. I'm talking here about tarps specifically designed to become shelters in the backcountry, whether you're camping or backpacking. It could just be cowboy camping with a tarp over you to keep the rain off. However, tarp camping in general has come a lot farther than that, to the point where tarp camping and tent camping can be almost the same thing. Let's look at the components of a typical tent camping setup. First of all, you're either going to have the tent floor or the tent floor plus a footprint or ground sheet. Typically, this is going to be a dirt, water, and insect impermeable material so that there is a layer of security between you, your other gear, and direct contact with the ground. Now, for some tents, they recommend also using a ground sheet in addition to the floor of the tent. This usually has more to do with protecting the tent than protecting your stuff, which the floor of a good tent should already be doing. Coming up from the floor is going to be the bug net. Essentially, this is material that you can see through that is not really going to give you any kind of protection from temperature or wind or water, but will keep the creepy crawlies from getting onto you, either by crawling on top of the floor or flying in through the sides. However, unless you are supremely confident that you are not going to get any rain or cold wind, you typically are then going to throw on a rain fly. This is tent material that is going to block wind and rain as well as insects, and it's also something you usually cannot see through. Now, that's just the material aspects of the tent. Now we have to do something to provide structure, and typically that's either going to be with a pole system that snaps in at the corners and that the material then attaches to. With a trekking pole tent, that structure is created by the geometry of the material and it being stretched over the top of some trekking poles, and then the whole thing becomes its own structure. The tarp camping setup can basically provide you with all of those same things. At the very least, tarp camping is going to include a tarp that's basically just going to keep out some wind and hopefully all of the rain. Think of the tarp as the rain fly of a tent. If you were to remove all the other features of the tent and you were left with nothing but a rain fly, you basically would be tarp camping. The structure for that tarp can come from a number of different places. You can set up a tarp with a trekking pole or 2 trekking poles, or you can also set a tarp up using trees as your poles. Once you have the trekking poles or the trees acting as your tent poles, you just need some guy lines to get that tarp attached, and now you have structure for your tarp. One of the first questions many people ask about tarp camping is, what about the bugs? Well, of course, a tarp by itself is not going to be able to keep any bugs from flying into your area or onto you from the ground. So you can add a bug bivy, bug netting, attached to a small ground sheet, sometimes even with corners, and this hangs from the same structure that the tarp does, and if it has a decent floor, it may also keep water out. So a bug bivy is basically the equivalent of a small tent inner. It's the mesh that keeps the bugs out, but not much else. Now, if you don't think you're going to need a bug bivy for where you're going to be camping, you still might be interested in putting down a ground sheet of some kind. Now, this isn't going to be the kind of ground sheet that you use with a tent that protects the tent, but rather it's going to be something that acts as like the floor of a tent, so that the gear that you place under your tarp is not sitting in dirt, is not getting punctured by small rocks or pine cones or pine needles, and it is going to protect your gear. You can also get ground sheets that can be staked out and stood up like a bathtub floor, either with your bug bivy or stand alone. So it is entirely possible to pretty much replicate a tent camping situation with tarp camping gear. What would be the point of doing so, however? It's starting to sound like you've basically just replaced a tent with a whole bunch of separate pieces that aren't going to be as easy to use as would a simple standalone tent. The main reason is that even if you do decide that you want your tarp camping setup to pretty much mimic a tent setup, is that now you have options instead of requirements. Because this kind of tarp camping system is modular, it is also very adaptable. The more modular any system is, the more adaptable it is, because you can swap parts out, you can leave parts at home, or you can bring everything and not use it. With a tent, you don't usually have a whole lot of options as to how you're going to set it up, how you're going to use it, what it's going to look like when you get done, and what the experience is going to be like once you get it set up. With a tarp camping system, if you arrive at an area and you realize, hey, there are no bugs here at all, you don't need to set up the bug net. If the weather has been dry and you've got a really good campsite selection and you're not too afraid of bugs, maybe you don't put down the ground sheet. But most of all, the tarp itself is incredibly adaptable. You might want to spread the whole thing out in a big A-frame so that you just get maximum coverage, but you could have it floating above the ground so that even though you are under your shelter in case of rain, you can still see everything around you. Or let's say the opposite happens and you get yourself into a pretty weather-intensive camping area and you don't have a whole lot of room to set up and there's really only one good spot. A tarp is going to be able to adapt by being folded into different shapes, hung by different kinds of guy lines, set up with different kinds of trees or poles, and this is going to allow you to get set up in places where your single setup tent may not fit or may not be able to be oriented correctly given the level of the ground and the way you want to sleep. If you need nearly the full tent experience, you can still have that, but any part that you don't need of that full tent camping experience is now yours to leave out. Now, the downside to this modularity and adaptability is that it requires some skills that you don't need to set up a tent. Although some tent setups have been famously aggravating, they usually follow a pretty similar pattern, and it's not that bad once you've set it up once or twice. With tarp camping, however, the number of things you can do is going to be largely dependent on your skill set. You're going to want to learn some knots, you're going to want to learn some folds, you're going to want to learn some strategies for using this gear effectively and not just run out into the wilderness and hope that you have your instructions with you. But as a counter to that, some of these things were part of the allure for me. I like learning new skills. I like having more things I can do in the outdoors. And so the idea that I was going to have to learn some knots and learn some setups was actually pretty cool. So for me, this is not a big negative, but for some people it might be. So the first reason you might want to try tarp camping is because of its modularity and adaptability to different situations. The second reason is its weight and volume. This is the Etowah 6x10 Ultra TNT tarp. Weighs in at 7 ounces. Yes, this could be my entire shelter if I don't feel like I need the bug net or the ground sheet. Even when you add in stakes and guy lines, you are still under a pound for what could be a complete shelter system. I, however, am not a big fan of bugs, and if I'm going to sleep outside, you can pretty well bet I'm going to use the bug net unless I am very confident that I am not going to have any creepy crawlies or flying things touching me in the night. For that, I have this. This is my Bug Bivy. This is the Yama Y-Zip Bug Bivy. It weighs 10.5 ounces. So now my entire shelter system looks like this, but just in case I want a ground sheet and I want something between the ground, possibly the mud, and my other gear, which I typically do, I'm going to pick up a ground sheet. This is the Gossamer Gear Polycryo ground sheet. It weighs 3.7 ounces. This whole thing is coming in at just barely over 21 ounces. This is 1.3 pounds, and it's basically all I need as far as the materials go. What I'm going to have to add to those materials is a trekking pole or two if I am not going to be able to use trees where I go. I'm going to need some tent stakes. 4 of these is pretty much the bare minimum. 6 is a lot safer for most of your folding setups. And I'm going to need some cordage. Now, this kind of stuff is usually included with a tent in the form of tent poles, tent stakes, and whatever guy lines you need. However, again, with the tarp camping setup, you get to choose what all of these are. So for example, I've got my Get Out Gear carbon trekkie poles, I've got my Wise Owl stakes in my Hilltop Pack Don't Lose 'em tent stake bag, and I've got my Durston Gear iron wire, because if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. But even pushing the adaptability and modularity aside, a tarp camping system is typically going to be far lighter than an equivalent tent camping system. If you're interested in how tarp camping can help you get your base weight down into the ultralight level, check this video out here. I managed to get my base weight under 9 pounds with this exact setup here. The third reason you might want to try tarp camping is cost. I have got some pretty good stuff here. This is not just some cheap junk I found on some Chinese website. This is the real deal. Nearly all of it is American made. It's made with high quality, top-notch materials. And yet that entire material setup runs $316 retail. So while tent camping in general can be cheaper than tarp camping in general, when you start comparing apples to apples, tarp camping is going to be a lot less. A fourth reason to try out tarp camping has to do with ventilation. One of the #1 complaints that you see with many tents has to do with condensation problems. Because a tent is generally pretty much fully enclosed other than some vents here or there, all of the breathing that you do during the night fills up that volume with moisture, and as the temperature drops, it condenses on the tent material. Now, if you have a double wall tent where the bug net and the rain fly are separate, that usually means that the condensation water is going to collect on the inside of the rain fly and not necessarily fall down through the bug netting on you. However, it does make packing the tent up kind of a pain. It makes drying out your gear a pain. And if you don't have a double wall tent and you're trying to go lighter weight by getting rid of the inner where it attaches to the rain fly, now you've got condensation that can also fall right onto your gear, including that nice down ultralight sleeping bag that you've got, and potentially ruin it as far as insulation goes. Heavy rain, heavy humidity, heavy breathing, all of these things could result in soaking wet gear when you wake up in the morning. However, there is almost no chance for very much condensation inside of a tarp because you're not really inside the tarp. You're under the tarp, but you're actually still outside. The airflow that comes through is going to make it so that your breath does not end up going straight onto the inner material and staying there, and that is going to massively help with the condensation problem. Now, of course, the negative to this is that all of that airflow means that you are much more exposed to the temperature of the air around you than you would be in a tent. Now, tent material is not typically known for holding in warmth. However, if it keeps the wind out, it is going to effectively keep the cold from coming in, and it is going to contain some of that warm air. So you are going to be warmer in a tent than you are in a tarp camping situation. You're going to need to mitigate your temperature loss with other gear. And this actually brings us to the fifth reason why you might want to try tarp camping, and that is your overall connection with nature. Most of us don't go through all the hassle and cost and time it takes to go hiking, camping, and backpacking if we aren't interested in reconnecting with nature. And there is something about being outside at night that really increases that connection. With a tarp camping setup that is raised above the ground, you could have a 360-degree view around you, and even if you are inside of a bug net, you still have a much closer connection to the nature around you. Now again, this might be a negative for some of you that would rather hide away from nature, but the reality is a tent doesn't actually protect you from most of the things that you might be afraid of. And so to me, having the tarp set up just is more realistic, doesn't give you a false sense of security. But again, that connection with nature, not necessarily something everybody wants, and also it may connect you with nature in some ways you don't want to be connected, such as splashback from rain, wind blowing through the tarp system, and bugs and insects getting in if you're not using a bug net. I hope this video has been enjoyable. If it has, would you mind giving it a like, and subscribe to Backcountry Pilgrim if you're into hiking, camping, backpacking, and the gear that goes with it. Until next time, I'm Doug. Thanks for watching.